Welcome to the Estates Made Simple podcast with Jenna Carvello and Gordon Vanderleek. We are on a mission to simplify the world of estate administration, helping executors gain the knowledge required to manage an estate. Please note, the following is for informational purposes only and is not to be considered legal, tax, or financial advice. We recommend you seek individualized advice for your unique situation with qualified professionals.
Well, Jenna, welcome to another episode of Estates Made Simple. Nice to podcast with you today and tackle another topic that hopefully is helpful for administrators and executors of estates. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Gord. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about out-of-province assets. What's interesting, and I've seen this trend over the years in my practice, is that more and more people have property in other locations, other provinces, if we're thinking Canada, but certainly in other countries. Not uncommon for people to say you got recreational property in a more hospitable climate than we have here in Calgary, where the condo in Palm Springs or the place in Phoenix on the golf course. And what do we wanted to explore a little bit about some of the considerations with regard to that and wanted to focus on the assets. What happens if you're the executor of an estate that has property outside of the borders of the province of Alberta? The probate process deals with that, but what about these other assets? Because it's more and more prevalent that as people's wealth increase, they look at saying, I want to buy investment properties or recreational properties. And so it's, I think, an important consideration for the executor to be aware of this as an issue, because it's something you're going to have to deal with the rules in every jurisdiction. So it might be helpful, Jenna, to just maybe kind of outline, and I know we've had a topic before on the whole probate process, but just kind of a refresher, because that's really sort of driving some of the steps you may have to take if in fact you're dealing with an estate with property outside of Alberta.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, so the first step is really to consider where probate should be filed first. And that's typically where the deceased was domiciled. Well, that is where the deceased was domiciled, where the primary residence is located, where the deceased lived and had the intention to reside indefinitely. And probate is really a process where the executor brings the original will to the court with a list of assets and information on the beneficiaries and a list of the debts, and asks the court for, it's a very one-page document, very simple document called the grant of probate. Asks the court for the grant of probate, and the court reviews the information supplied, and the grant of probate really does two things. One, it verifies that the last will brought forward is in fact the last will of the deceased, and two, it just gives the executor authority to start dealing with the assets, collecting it in from the various institutions and distributing to the beneficiaries. You typically need probate if the estate has real property in the deceased's name alone, or if there's significant balances at a financial institution. So that could be even 30 to 40,000 would be sort of the threshold of what you'd expect to need probate for. There are some other circumstances you might want to get probate for if the estate's going to get contentious, or maybe you expect a claim to be filed. But in general, if you had those two types of assets, then you definitely need probate. And so, once you go through that process, then you can figure out, okay, where else do I need probate? And maybe Gord, I'll let you speak to that and what that looks like.
Yeah, so just to emphasize what you said before, Jenna, one of the first considerations an executor has to decide, well, where is this person ordinarily resident, and in which jurisdiction do I apply? A little more granular, even within Alberta, you have to figure out which judicial center, like was it Calgary, is it Edmonton, is it Red Deer, Wetaskiwin, Lethbridge? Normally it's fairly obvious to go, this is where the person lived. In some cases it may get a little more complicated, at which point you may need a legal opinion to say what's the right jurisdiction to apply. But it's normally, as you say, where the person is resident. What did they call home? Right? And where did they reside on that? In some more complicated situations, especially for higher net worth people who might have property all over the place, and they spend the summers in Mexico, and then or winters in Mexico, summers in Canada, and then they got a place in Australia, and they're spend an equal amount of time in all jurisdictions. Well, where actually are they ordinarily domiciled? So it can be a complicated issue, but assuming you figure that out, you are then going to, in the application in Alberta, you can only list those assets that are in Alberta. And again, that in some cases is a complicated, seems like a simple question, but can get complicated. But leaving the complications aside, that really the question is, if you say, well, you have the bank account here, you have your principal residence and the like, this is all located in Alberta, but what about the recreational property in British Columbia? I mean, a lot of people have that, right? If they either inherited or they purchased property in British Columbia, and that's where they like to spend their summer months or skiing in the winter, then what do? I own the property. And as you indicated, land titles has a pretty black and white rule. They will only deal with the court-approved legal representative of the estate. So that usually drives the process of saying, well, I have to deal with probate. So in Alberta, we're going to list all the Alberta-based assets. Actually, in the surrogate digital process, you can actually list assets that are owned that are outside. So you even have to identify the out-of-province assets as part of that application and part of the notice to beneficiaries. But then once you get the grant of probate, you then have to reseal in every province where the person owns property, right? So, if it's, let's say they had lots of recreational properties, just to create maybe kind of a bit of a weird example, but it illustrates the point. Most everything is here in Alberta, the investments and the like, but, they had a condo in Invermere and, a property in Palm Springs and a property in Arizona. Well, guess what? They're having to do there's 4 probate applications in all likelihood, right? There's the main one that you start with in Alberta, and then you would reseal the application in British Columbia, in California, and in Arizona. So it starts with hiring lawyers in those jurisdictions to help you through that process, to be able to get the legal position so you could administer that asset. In the context of real estate, assuming you're going to sell them, let's say, or, before you put that MLS for sale sign on the front lawn or advertise it, have it listed on the internet, you need the legal authority. And guess what? The real estate agent is all likelihood going to say, well, show me you're the legal representative of the estate who has the authority to deal with this property. So you have to do that through that application process, that probate. So the rules are all different in each jurisdiction. We call that kind of a resealing application. So you get your grant of probate and then you have it applicable in each jurisdiction and have to follow the rules that are applicable in those jurisdictions. So first you apply where you're ordinarily domiciled. Let's assume that's in Alberta for most of the situations we come across. And then you look at properties in those other jurisdictions.
And aligned with that too is determining the cost of probate. So as we mentioned in prior episodes, probate in Alberta is very low in consideration to other provinces. So I think, Gord, is the flat fee still $525 last time?
$525.
Yeah. And so in some other provinces, they charge a percentage for the assets that are held there. So just as an example, if you probated your estate here in Alberta and then you had a vacation property in BC, what would happen is you'd pay $525 here in Alberta, then you take that application, reseal it in BC, and BC would charge 1.4% on the value of that BC property. So you don't have to pay probate fees on everything you own, even included in Alberta on that BC application, but you will need to pay the 1.4% on BC situs assets, which I think it's a good thing. I mean, you're not going to be charged too much if you just have that one property, but it does make a difference in the overall cost for the estate administration.
I should, in answering the question you posed to me, clarify that there's actually a bit of a scale in Alberta. For smaller estates, when we say it's $525, the assumption is the estate is more than $250,000. Then it kind of maxes out at $525. And they have a slide. It starts, if the estate is $10,000 or less, then it's $35, and then it's sort of a sliding scale if the estate's between $10,000 and $250 for different amounts. So it could be technically a little bit less than that, but on the assumption is most estates are more than that, then that's the typical fee of $525. The other thing that's interesting, and it sort of relates more to a planning exercise, would be, is there a way to avoid those probate fees, right? So sometimes I'll have conversations with clients to say, well, maybe we should put that property into a trust, or do you want to put your kids on as joint owners so there's right of survivorship for that property? It's a whole other topic and a bit of complication to answer those questions, so I don't want to make it appear that's overly simplified, but it's an area worth exploring exploring. Like if you're saying, how can I make things as easy as possible for my executor? Then those are things you might say, well, let's set it up so we don't have to go through the probate process. We can save those particular fees, right? So there's sometimes some planning opportunities, but in it, depending on the nature of the assets, number one, you have an obligation to preserve and protect them. So if the other point, I think from an estate administration perspective would be, well, do we know there's proper insurance, on those properties? Are people renting it? Is it like on Airbnb and you've got to deal with all of that? Or is somebody coming in maintaining them? Is the roof leaking and you kind of have to deal with that? So it might involve actually a site visit. You may have to, I got to go there and take a look at this place and make sure everything is preserved. What about the contents of these properties, right? You don't want somebody to break in and steal those things, because what if one of the items gifted in the will was located in one of these other properties, right? So these are good things to know before you go in. We had a prior episode talking about what questions you should ask if you're thinking about getting an appointment. This might be a question, right? We talked about knowing the assets, but then, okay, what about these properties? Like, where's your insurance agent? It'd be nice to have a list of those so you could get on the, making sure they're all up to date and taking, making sure you get proper valuations you have to go deal with a realtor maybe, or, property appraiser to get proper valuations to know what to put in for the valuations for these probate applications, right? And hire professionals to help you through that process. So these properties, if you have property in other jurisdictions, by definition, that's likely not, although it could be, your principal residence. So do you have all the information you need to determine capital gains, right? Capital gains is what did the person pay for it plus any capital improvements, and the difference between that number and fair market value is what you have to input into the tax return to calculate capital gains. So do you have all that information? You have to go around and find that information to be able to go in, or determine if it's an investment account in a different jurisdiction for some reason. What are those relevant information? What's the relevant information that the account will need in terms of, its cost base and, current values and any capital gains and things like that. So taking stock of that property, what's in the different provinces, what legal process do I have to go through, hiring the lawyers and the other professionals to help you manage that property, and then ultimately deal with it in accordance with the terms of the will, right? Is it specifically gifted to a person? Do you have to sell it? Is this a good time to sell in the market? Should you hold on to it for a little while and rent it? These are all questions you have to deal with as part of administering property in different provinces.
Well, and I think that highlights an important point, is that you need professionals knowledgeable in that jurisdiction. So you may not be able to use the same lawyer. You may not be able to use the same real estate agent, most likely not. So having, a network of professionals that can assist you would be very, very valuable, just to ensure that you're doing everything you need to maximize the value of the estate.
Exactly. So I think those are some good questions to ask. Obviously, every situation is a little bit different, but hopefully that provides you a starting point for delving into what you need to do in terms of being able to administer assets with in other jurisdictions, right? And understanding the laws of those jurisdictions and navigating that whole process. So we thank you for listening to this episode. If there's questions that have been sparked by listening to us talk about this topic, certainly reach out to us. We're happy to answer any specific questions that people have on this topic. Thanks for listening. We encourage always people to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You get the notification of new episodes coming forward. And as always, if you have comments on topics you'd like us to cover, or any questions, as I've said, with regard to anything we've talked about, feel free to reach out to us. As you can see, we love talking about this stuff. And if that's a conversation that is needed, please reach out. We'd love to have the conversation with you. And until next time, Jenna, thank you for podcasting, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Excellent. Take care.